Before I tell you what this conference is about, I'll tell you what this conference is not about. And this conference is not necessarily about electoral politics. We're not here to simply rehash what has already been stated a million times in every single news agency. We are here to find an alternative solution to politics and to find a practical way to help promote free markets, human liberties, freedoms, and human rights. I'm here to talk about the startup society's solution. And a very interesting case study is that of China. In 1990, this is Shanghai. Shanghai was a relatively small town. And in only 20 years, Shanghai has achieved an incredible amount of growth. Much of this growth has been attributed to the special economic zones. How did China, a once very poor and communist country, escape communism and it's become the second largest capitalistic superpower in the world? What lessons can we learn? How can we apply them to our own societies? So in the 1950s and 60s, there was a very grave famine in China. There was an American missionary who gave a story about his experience there. And he went through this forest and he asked his guides, why are there no squirrels and birds? And his guide replied that they'd all been eaten. And they keep going, and in this desolate, empty forest, and none of the trees have any bark. And the reason why the trees didn't have bark is because the locals were so hungry that they would chew off the bark and scrape it off and just try to eat it. 30 to 40 million people died. This is multiple Holocausts. It is the worst tragedy, human tragedy in all of human history. The poverty level was intense. And then the insanity came to an end. China had an insane economic system. All of the farms were collectivized. Anybody who attempted to farm independently, or anybody who owned, say, more pigs than their neighbor, had their property confiscated by the state and forcefully redistributed, which is at the root of many of these economic crises that China faced. So in 1976, when Mao died, China could finally begin to recover. This is the story of the rebirth of the Middle Kingdom. So in the 1960s and 70s, not all of China was in crisis. There was one part of China which in fact was booming, Hong Kong. Hong Kong was attracting thousands, tens of thousands of immigrants from the mainland, because in Hong Kong there was food, there was security, there was opportunity, there were jobs. So the Chinese government was interested in replicating Hong Kong. Deng Xiaoping came to power, and unlike his predecessor Mao, Deng was very pragmatic. He did not necessarily believe that communism was the best way to run a society. And he wanted to help bring the Hong Kong model to the rest of China. So his solution was to create 4 special economic zones around Hong Kong. So these 4 zones were on the mainland, right off the coast of where Hong Kong is. So a special economic zone is a little territory that is exempt from a nation's laws. Here's the Guangzhou Special Economic Zone. Michael Spector, who is a journalist for the New York Times and Washington Post, said, quote, until the 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping legislated the area as China's first special economic zone, Shenzhen had been a tiny fishing village. Suddenly, 11 million people appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Factories sprang up, often housed in hastily constructed tower blocks. So, for such dramatic results, one might imagine that it would have taken very drastic social reforms to take China from the edge of starvation, 30, 40, maybe even 50 million dead, to millions of people appearing and factories springing up out of nowhere. In fact, there was simply 4 very simple, very basic key principles that was driving the special economic zone. The first was that economic activities were to be driven by market forces. Central planners in Beijing would no longer determine how many bras would go 1,000 miles away. Most companies could be privately owned and thus foreign owned. Before this, foreign investors could only invest in the state-run companies, which of course is not very attractive. So for the first time in the special economic zones, you could have private companies. Production was to be export-oriented. So instead of the Chinese who had heavy tariffs, and wanted to consume everything they produced, they allowed free trade into these zones, free trade in and out, which allowed for an export economy and built up China as the manufacturing power that we know today. And last, the infrastructure and buildings were no longer to be managed, built, and funded by the state, but instead were to be managed, built, and funded by private parties who have incentives to maintain and keep growing them. So the special economic zones were a huge success. In 1980, there were 4 by the coast of Hong Kong. Within 4 years, by 1984, it was very obvious that the special economic zones were a success, and Deng Xiaoping ordered the creation of 14 more. Now, in 2016, much of China's major cities have been turned into special economic zones, and about 40% of the Chinese population live inside of these zones. These zones account for China's escape from communism. It wasn't that communism was repealed on the national level. Communism was repealed city by city, and it worked. Here's China's GDP since 1960. And you can see that it increases exponentially. 1980 is the creation of the first special economic zone, and 1988 is when the widespread reforms towards making special economic zones mainstream in China appeared. Here's China's GDP per capita by province, and you can see that it correlates very strongly with the position of the special economic zones. The World Bank had a research paper to determine how the special economic zones affected China. And what they found in 2007 is that the special economic zones were the primary force that was driving China's technological growth. Most of China's technology came from the zones and spread to the rest of mainland China from the zones. 70% of Chinese patents originated in the zones. So one very big question was how property rights were protected in the zones. You see, foreign-owned investors, they didn't want to invest in China, because if you invest in China, some government agents might knock on your door one day and say, this factory now belongs to the state, which created a lot of regime uncertainty, a lot of risk. But the Chinese solved this by abolishing eminent domain in some of the special economic zones. And the result? Nail houses. What you find is that the freeways are built around the houses because property rights are so respected that they didn't want to steal this. And you can see another nail house. In this nail house right here, this was actually a building that was being leased from the Chinese government, and there was a judge who made a ruling. This building was part of a much larger apartment complex, and one family refused to sell their private property. And the judge ruled that the road builders could demolish as much of the complex as necessary to build the road, but had to leave enough structurally intact so that the family could continue to live in the portion that they didn't demolish. So you might say, isn't China supposed to be communist? How is communist China justifying this system which frankly seems much more capitalistic than anything you'd find in the West? Well, Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. So let's take China's growth model and repeat it elsewhere. So in 2008, the World Bank had a big FIAS report. And this report was to determine the feasibility of special economic zones elsewhere, outside of China, to see if the model could be replicated in other third world countries to rapidly industrialize. They conclude, quote, zones can and do play a major role in employment creation in certain countries. The rate of job creation, for example, has been remarkable. Employment in the Dominican Republic's industrial free zones rose from 500 in 1970 to almost 200,000 today. Almost 1 million people are employed in the Philippines' eco-zones. Special economic zones also account for a country's exports really fast. So here in the blue, you can see the exports. These are all countries that have special economic zones. And in blue, you can see the exports that originate from the zones and go elsewhere. And in green, you see the exports that originate from elsewhere in the country outside of the zones. And you find that once these zones appear in a country, very rapidly exports shift and start coming increasingly out of those zones. The number of special economic zones worldwide has rapidly increased. Here you can see it went from almost none to 100 in 1980 or so, 1,000 in 1995, I think, 3,000 in 2000, and currently there's about 5,000 special economic zones worldwide. A lot of the growth in third world countries that we hear a lot about has been driven by these zones. So what are some examples of startup societies outside of China? And what are some other models that we can follow? Because special economic zones are one model, but not the only model. There's Singapore, which is a city-state. In the 1950s, Singapore was part of Malaysia. It was an impoverished third world country. And basically, Lee Kuan Yew created the nation out of nothing. And there was all of this uncertainty around Singapore. How are we going to trust this third world government to follow our rules? You know, how are Western investors going to trust Singapore? Well, what the Singaporeans did is they hired the top British legal scholars to write their law because they were already trusted. There's India. India has roughly 100 special economic zones outside of major cities. And although these zones aren't perfect, the Indians didn't do the zones as well as the Chinese did. They're still pretty interesting and still offer a lot of development opportunities. So, for example, what these zones have developed, the private sector in these zones has developed to the same degree as Singapore today. However, public services remain, you know, fire, water, sewage, electricity. That remains sort of like typical Indian level. There's Liechtenstein in Europe. And in case if you don't know where Liechtenstein is, you can see it's this tiny city-state on the Swiss border. So Liechtenstein is centuries old, has always existed, and is the most economically free place in Europe, has the lowest crime per capita, and the highest GDP per capita. There's Dubai, which also is another interesting growth story. The Middle Eastern countries were too unstable and too poor to extract the oil. So this is Dubai in 1990. This is Dubai today, the same place. And what happened is they created the special economic zone, which had the right rules and reforms and regulations so that foreign businesses could safely and securely invest and start extracting the oil. There's Monaco. And in case if you don't know where Monaco is, it's on the Franco-Italian border right there. So Monaco is surrounded by extremely unfree countries. Italy, France, these are places where it's impossible to hire and fire people. In Monaco, it was made very easy. And as a result, Monaco is the richest part of France. In fact, we, right here, are standing in a startup society. Portsmouth was a colonial town like most of America. And America was not founded by people who didn't want less freedom. It was founded by people who sought to have more economic, more religious, more social freedom. So they left Europe and founded the 13 colonies. Startup societies are not a Chinese invention. They're an American invention. And there's nothing more American than startup societies. So let's learn from the startup societies of yesterday and build the startup societies of tomorrow. Welcome to the first Startup Societies Summit.